some of the stuff you've done over the years. GI Joe in particular is something we're interested in. Tell us a little bit about what went into creating the character of Flynn.
I stood in a line of probably 150 actors, literally 40 years ago, on a sunny day in Studio City, California, near Universal, and outside a little recording facility called Wally Burr Recording. Wally Burr was the director who was hired by Hasbro for all the Transformers TV cartoon episodes and GI Joe, All American Hero, and each one of us in our hands, our sweaty little actors' hands, had a single piece of paper with a very sort of crude black and white drawing of a character. Mine happened to be Flint. I don't know how carefully they listened to demos that the agents gave them, but in line was every voice actor in Hollywood who I'd ever worked with, plus all these raggedy old character actors from the 50s and 60s. I mean, who I had seen as a kid when I was 8 years old, the Virginian, Have Gun Will Travel, Gunsmoke. And I mean, they called everybody. And it was Sunbow Productions who was doing the physical production, and Hasbro that owned the franchise. And we had no idea what this was about. Was it a toy commercial? What was it? And, we waited and waited, and the line slowly, brought me up to mine. I'd walk up the steps, and here were 12, Hasbro executives, Sunbow executives, writers, directors, crowded into this booth with no chairs, with a great big, rock and roll mixing console. And Wally Burr, who identified himself as, I was the youngest tank commander in World War II. So you do what I say. Literally, this is what the guy said as part of his direction. And I looked, and the black and white drawing of Flynn, obviously a special forces guy, black beret and big pectoral muscles and thick neck. And so I gave my toughest read, and I think the direction was tougher, louder. Come on, man, get it on. I mean, that was it. 8 words of direction, and I did a take 2 and maybe a take 3, and that was it. Thank you. Next, and I think literally behind me was my friend Mary McDonnell Lewis, who ended up playing the character of Lady J. And it was interesting because it wasn't all guys. There were a lot of women who were auditioning for women's parts as the Joe team. And so I knew that G.I. Joe, my dad had given me a G.I. Joe comic book when I was a little kid, but this is a character who fought in the Korean War and who was later made by Hasbro into an 11.5-inch action figure doll, to match Mattel's Barbie. And actually, there are secret stories about Barbie and G.I. Joe, but I'll let you ask those questions.
Okay. Well, you can't tease me like that without giving me a little bit more. Do tell.
Years later, and I'll get back to the audition. Years later, when Mattel was having some trouble, after hugely successful years with Barbie, and every Barbie vehicle and house and television shows, their stock had reached untold heights, along with Hasbro's, with G.I. Joe and Transformers action figures. But then things kind of drifted back to normal with the stock market. And so during Operation Desert Storm in Iraq and Kuwait, Barbie magazine featured Barbie and G.I. Joe, and we don't know who the character was. Was it Duke? Was it Flint? We don't know. It's sort of the generic member of the Joe team, sunning half clothed under an umbrella on the beach. And not being a Barbie fan, I don't own the magazine, so I can't read the details of the story, but man, it looked pretty hot.
So were you surprised by the eventual success of the series and how much of a sort of iconic thing it became?
Yeah, Eric, completely. Again, we had no idea. All we knew was there was this 11.5-inch figure. And what we learned later was in the 70s, as the Vietnam War dwindled down, parents who were buying G.I. Joe, the figure, for their kids got tired of war toys. And Hasbro's stock had lowered as a result. And so, in secret, Hasbro, which was located in Rhode Island, contacted the Rhode Island National Guard and said, "We're thinking of doing a TD cartoon for kids with a Joe team, a bunch of action figures. If we do an honest rendering, and if we somehow promote the existence of the Rhode Island National Guard, would you let us look at your weapons and examine your uniforms?" True story. And so about maybe 3 weeks later, I get a call from Asian. Remember that GI Joe thing? Yeah. You got the part. What part? Flint. Oh, that guy with the black beret. Okay. And again, I didn't know if it was a toy commercial or a one-off. And so I go to the studio, and here are the actors playing Scarlet and Duke and Destro and Cobra Commander. And I think about 8 microphones were lined up in Wally Burr's recording studio, which looks, if you've seen films of, of the Beatles in a recording studio, this is sort of a small version of that without the drum kit. And we recorded over a couple of weeks, 6 episodes for a miniseries, G.I. Joe, All-American Hero. And Hasbro and Sunbro Productions were testing the waters. They didn't want to invest in a season or 13 episodes if this wasn't going to sell. None of the networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, I don't think Fox existed at the time, wanted it. None of the networks wanted it for their Saturday morning TV. Why? Who knows? So the sales and marketing department of Hasbro and Sunbow had to get on their walking shoes and go station group to station group around the country. And they successfully sold the 6 episodes. Everybody knew about G.I. Joe, from Atlanta to Portland, Maine. And it did well. The ratings were good. So then Hasbro commissioned Sunbow to produce, I think, 13 episodes. They invented more characters of the Joe team. And at that time, Star Wars had made Mr. George a billionaire. And he had shrunken the idea of action figures down from about a foot long to 3.5 inches, made in China, where the head would move and the arms would move, and that was about it. And you couldn't change the costume or the uniform. But they sold like hotcakes. And so Hasbro wanted part of that action. And then they were told by the FCC in the early 80s, you cannot advertise action figures from your show within the 30 minutes of the airing of that show. It's illegal. Kids under 7 have been proven to be too vulnerable to advertising. Forget it. You can advertise your G.I. Joe figures in the Barbie show if you want. And needless to say, Hasbro went to Ronald Reagan, who was against that kind of regulation, and he helped them out. And Hasbro went to Marvel Comics and said, if we pay you and give you part of the action, would you create a G.I. Joe comic book? And we'll create the television advertising for the comic book, not G.I. Joe, the TV show, but for the comic book, which just happened to look exactly like the TV show. The comic books, which a lot of Joe fans own, these mint comic books made in the early 80s, were drawn by the brilliant animator Larry Hama, still alive and well and still making brilliant comic books. So they were allowed to air the ads for the comic books for G.I. Joe within G.I. Joe, the show. And kids were sort of like, oh, Daddy, I want an action figure of Destro. No, you don't, kid. I'll buy you Joe and Duke. How's that? I'll buy you Flint and Lady J. How's that? And so that's a very long-winded answer to your question of the birth of G.I. Joe, All-American Hero, 52 episodes that lasted 2 seasons. And that's a whole other issue. Why didn't it go on for any more seasons?